in many cases of massive torts, restructuring of companies, dirty assets ending up held by new spin-offs, bankruptcies being declared, all kinds of things, right? And the concern is how much of the funds are then going to go to people in the global south who, unlike people in Vermont, haven't benefited so much from a fossil fuel based economy. Most of the people in Vermont who are, going to be protected by adaptation projects funded by this legislation. Whereas there are people in countries in the global south who are just as vulnerable or more vulnerable who may not have received those benefits. And so there is a fundamental justice question here.
For the 3rd of July, 2024, it's not so long now. Polls are going to be opening in just a few hours here in the UK. I'm Richard Delevin. This is Wicked Problems. One of the reasons not to scoff when Ed Miliband came out to The Guardian this week and said that Labour would restore Britain's climate leadership in the event his party gets as big or bigger a majority as polls suggest, is that he wouldn't be starting from scratch. There is infrastructure, and by that I don't mean hardware like HS2 or doubling the size of the grid, though give Dogger Bank and projects like it their due, offshore wind has changed the game for UK energy. But the infrastructure I mean is more like wetware, the connection of brains, who often, thanklessly, have been beavering away doing the hard yards and thinking through the issues around attribution science, climate policy, measurability, disclosure, and climate litigation. And few places have done as much as the Grantham Institute, the virtual organization with pockets all across London, especially in the LSE and Imperial, to keep working to create light rather than just heat on climate conversations. We're delighted that Kate Hyam, policy fellow at Grantham and head of their Climate Laws of the World project, could join us for a chat about their 6th annual report released last week on the state of global climate litigation. We'll have that in a minute. And as the climate political Sturm und Drang of U-turns and accusations of broken promises take up a lot of headlines and headspace, I've become convinced that one of the only things that keeps the fossil fuel industry up at night are these lawsuits and allied new laws that seek to complement them. But before we get into that, tomorrow, election night here in the UK, we have assembled a 2-hour live show with incredible guests across media, politics, industry, activism, even comedy. And we're even delighted to say the band whose music you hear at the start of each episode of our show, Sun Charmer, will join us for an exclusive set. So from 9 to 11 UK time, we'll have fast-moving panel discussions as the exit poll drops at 10 p.m., and we'll have people with backgrounds in Labour, the Greens, Lib Dems, and very excited about this, even someone who used to work for Lyndon Crosby on the Conservative campaigns of yore, joining us to do instant analysis. If you want to be able to ask questions and take part in the conversation, you got to be registered for the event, which will be on Zoom. To be able to take part of the Q&A, you'll be able to see it on other platforms, but our over-caffeinated producer will have enough on his plate, looking at moderating one channel, and that'll be Zoom. So come hang with us there. It's going to be great. And now, delighted to bring you this conversation with Grantham's Kate Hyam, and stick around after for some observations on the level of freakout for climate policy we're seeing in the US, France, lots of other places, but weirdly, not here in the UK. Now here's Kate.
In the climate justice system, people are represented by two separate yet equally important groups. Big oil, who want to continue business as usual at any cost, and the few people brave enough to take them to court. These are their stories.
Kate Hyam, policy fellow at the Grantham Institute, head of the Climate Laws of the World project. Thank you for coming on Wicked Problems.
Thank you for having me.
You guys had launched your 6th report about trends in global climate litigation last week, as I understand. Congratulations.
Thank you. We're very pleased that it's finally out in the world. They take quite a lot of time to put together.
And you're working with the Sabine Center at Columbia, right? That's one of your sources for the data set in order to be able to say the trends about what's they're going up, they're going down, they're going sideways, etc.
Absolutely. So we've been collaborating with the Sabine Center since 2015 or 2016 to better understand the kind of global landscape of climate change law. And we use their data set of climate cases as the primary source for the report series. So it's really a strong collaboration with colleagues from Sabine, and it wouldn't be possible to put it together at all without all of the amazing work that they're doing.
You've got an amazing background in human rights law and in working with the Carbon Disclosure Project. So you kind of came to this well prepared to look at this from all sides of the puzzle. But having that big data set to work with, I guess let's just jump right in. We've had several guests on the show, particularly in the last couple of months, where we've really tried to focus down on this a little bit more, certainly not like yourself for years and years and years. But it felt to us and some of our guests that the trend has just been this ever climbing, going upward. It feels like we're maybe heading to some sort of crescendo of some kind. Nigel Brook from Clyde & Co. suggested that felt right. But your report says something slightly different, which I was surprised at in terms of the number of cases, at least. Tell us about that.
So in the report, we look at the increase in cases filed year on year. And what we're seeing is that from a peak in 2021, what appears to be happening is that in 2022 and 2023, we're seeing slightly fewer cases being filed than we saw at that 2021 peak. What I think is actually going on there is probably something to do with data collection. So as the field has diversified, as there have become more and more cases being filed, it is harder to process them all into the databases, into the data sets in a timely way. So it's likely that this is a data collection issue, and that actually what we see is that 2022 and 2023 are similar in terms of the number of cases to 2021. There may be some small variation. So what does that suggest? Well, it suggests that there may still be some kind of plateau being reached in terms of the number of new cases being filed. That plateau, of course, is somewhere between probably 250 and 300 new climate cases, if we account for this delay in data collection. So that's still a large number of cases being filed. Nobody is saying this is something that's going away and we have zero cases. But there might be different reasons behind that. Some of this could relate to the political circumstances in some of the big countries where we see a lot of litigation. Some of it could relate to people watching and waiting while some of the sort of pioneer cases in particular areas progressing through the courts. We're not sure. So this is something I think we need to keep an eye on for the future. But as I say, I certainly think that we are going to see more and more cases being added, being recorded for those years where it looks like there's a decline. So what we see is either a plateau or maybe a slowing in the growth.
Right. We don't have a taxonomy per se, but your report obviously puts out one in terms of different types of cases. Where are there areas of growth? Because I think your report points to a couple of those that are becoming both more frequent and more salient in terms of their potential impact and how they've emerged from things we wouldn't have seen, when you first started putting this kind of report out.
So I point to two kind of important areas there. One is that we have seen a lot of growth in what we call government framework cases. So these are cases that are being filed against governments challenging their sort of whole of government approach to climate action, typically challenging the adequacy of their emissions reduction targets or challenging whether or not they're actually doing anything to meet emissions reduction targets that have been set. And this is one that's perhaps not surprising that we continue to see so much growth in this area, because we have landmark cases going back to 2015 and the first judgment in the Agenda Foundation and State of the Netherlands case, where courts have been willing to hold governments accountable to certain standards, often using human rights arguments. But we've seen that really continuing to grow, and there are now more than 110 of those cases around the world. So I think that's a sort of important foundational piece that we shouldn't neglect. Where we've seen perhaps less easily anticipated growth is in the area of climate litigation against corporations. So we've seen lots of new cases being filed against companies, including, most significantly, cases challenging what we call climate washing. So these are cases where a company is saying that it is doing X, Y, or Z on climate change, that it's set these targets, and is being challenged in court because those statements were misleading, or it didn't have the operational plans to back up the targets that it says that it's going to meet. We've seen more than 140 of these cases being filed in recent years, around 50 of them in 2023. So really a very recent, significant growth area. And one of the things that's so remarkable about them is that 70% of these cases have successful outcomes for the claimants. So courts or other bodies are agreeing with the claimants that there is something misleading in the company's advertising. I think what we need to be a little bit careful about is what is the real impact of these cases as compared to some of the other kinds of cases that are actually sort of fundamentally trying to target the business models of companies. And those are the cases that we call in the report the polluter pays cases and corporate framework cases, which take a similar line to those cases against governments that I've just mentioned.
Here in the UK, the Advertising Standards Authority would have been, one of the bodies that would have adjudicated against certain airlines and the claims that they would have made. And under consumer protection law, certain attorneys general in the US looking at, taking on particular companies about their claims and saying you misled about statements. So, but I think to your point, like these feel like it's kind of like, yeah, so what? It's like, yeah, you have to change your advertising. I mean, that doesn't seem like a huge penalty, or maybe you pay a small fine compared to what that is versus these polluter pays cases, which I think I did want to ask you about as well. But before I do that, one other area that I was intrigued, and I want to just probe a little bit, given I want to keep it really short because of time, is these biodiversity cases and the increase of biodiversity cases. One of the things you also highlight is this growth of cases where we're seeing, for maybe more casual observers, kind of cases and people winding up as opponents of, say, clean energy projects that we wouldn't have expected. Of the famously, Greta Thunberg, with working with the Sami to work against the Statkraft onshore wind project that, is meant to allegedly interferes with reindeer herding practices in the Sami regions. But I suppose the idea of watching Greta Thunberg protest against a wind farm is just kind of counterintuitive for most people. And I suppose a lot of people look at cases on the East Coast of the US or other places, or Australia, where people have made somewhat spurious biodiversity claims to try to block offshore wind projects. I mean, is that a worry that if we're counting all these as part of the same bucket of cases, that some of these things might sneak in as being like, is this really a biodiversity case, or is this somebody using a sock puppet to try and stop, a renewables project?
I think that's a really valid point of concern. So I think there are cases where there is a need for scrutiny about how the climate transition is being implemented and how that is impacting on the rights of people or on nature and ecosystems. I think that's an absolutely valid point. And that Sami reindeer herding case that you've mentioned, I think is a good example of a case where we can't repeat the problems of the past when we're transitioning. But as you say, one of the things we talk about in the report is concern about this line of argument being co-opted by the same players that have been actively trying to delay climate action for a long time and becoming just one new tactic in their toolbox for trying to avoid changes that are going to threaten their vested interests. And in the report, we cite some work from Brown University looking at all of the different actors that are involved in opposing offshore wind in the East Coast, as you say, in the States. And it's really interesting to see the parallels between those actors and actors that have a history of involvement with climate delay. So, yeah, I think it's a very valid concern. I mean, we put them all in the same category in the report because we want to highlight that there are these tensions. But what you then need to do about that is an open question.
Yeah, I think it's always interesting if you see someone like Donald Trump turn around and suddenly is very concerned about whales, having expressed no concern about any megafauna or anything much else in the past. But now he's very concerned about that somehow being at the fault of offshore wind for whale deaths. But never mind that. The other thing I wanted to ask you about, it again, not specifically about any particular piece of U.S. legislation, but more about this broader, kind of concept that extending from these polluter pays type of piece of litigation, which are obviously undergoing a very torturous process where federal challenges are being issued in terms of like that review, and God knows where that's going to go. But in Vermont, we had this, first of its kind law, which I heard about months and months ago. But then I found that what I found really interesting is I found climate tech startups were paying attention to this bill making its way through the Vermont legislature. And I was like, why would you be doing that? Like, well, because they're going to have a fund and someone's going to have to make an adjudication about like what the probabilities are for damages in terms of future infrastructure, and like also source attribution for like who has to pay if you wanted to carve it up, have some kind of scientific basis for making that judgment. I've seen other model framed legislation like in New York where it just comes up with a figure out of the air and just says 75 billion. We'll just carve it up. How'd you get the number? Well, we just know we need a lot to restore beaches on the east end of Long Island. That seems like a really terrible argument. So I'm just wondering, and you're the launch of your report last week, one of your co-panelists expressed a concern that if, in the developed world, particular jurisdictions do hold, kind of have strict liability, they skip right over the kind of judicial process and say, we're just going to hold you as a sovereign. We're going to say you are responsible as a finding of fact. Here's a bill, please pay up, to your Exxons, your Chevrons, your BPs, your Shells. Your co-panelists expressed concern that other parts of the world would then find themselves at the back of the queue when it comes to actually getting adaptation funding. It feels like a pretty nettlesome problem, but I guess are we to, how do we prioritize? How do we think about that conundrum? Or should we have to worry about that? Is it just going to play itself out?
I think we do have to think about that conundrum. I think we do have to worry about that conundrum because although I see the same positive aspects of the Vermont bill that you just talked about, the fact that we are going to see an Environment Agency having to make some really tricky scientific determinations, which will have some authority and advance the conversation, even if that bill ultimately is successfully challenged in the courts, which, will definitely be challenged in the courts. Whether that's successful, we don't know, right? So I think that is progress in kind of trying to develop the basis for saying these companies should have some responsibility for what are the natural and logical consequences of their activities. But I do think that Harry was absolutely right to question what happens if these developments are confined to countries in the global north, which is where most of the companies in question are domiciled, and therefore where it's going to be easiest, although I think by no means easy, to actually enforce some kind of requirement that they cough up some cash. I think if that happens, what we see in many cases of massive torts is, restructuring of companies, dirty assets ending up held by, particular new spin-offs, and et cetera, bankruptcies being declared, all kinds of things, right? So we'll see lots of different tactics being used to try and deal with this. And the concern is how much of the funds are then going to go to the people in the global south who, unlike people in Vermont, haven't benefited so much from, a fossil fuel-based economy for however many years. I think the Vermont bill is saying we're looking at greenhouse gas emissions from 1995 to 2024, right? So that's 30 years. And over those 30 years, most of the people in Vermont who are, going to be protected by adaptation projects funded by this legislation, if it ever gets implemented, they have benefited largely from the use of fossil fuels, whereas there are people in countries in the global south who are just as vulnerable or more vulnerable who may not have received those benefits. And so there is a fundamental justice question here. I mean, what I think is difficult is that addressing that, negotiating that, requires very unprecedented work that we haven't done before. Thinking about, how do you create some kind of global settlement, and how do you prioritize the most vulnerable within that? That's not something we have any precedent for. There are, if I could just make one more point, there are some scholars who've said, okay, rather than doing that, why don't we look at something else that would work here, like a global tax or a global levy on fossil fuels? And I think in some ways, a good outcome from all of this would be that countries realize there's this justice issue and they impose that levy, and we see it resolved that way rather than through the courts or through these kinds of individual pieces of legislation. But we don't know how it's going to play out.
So I think that's a series of valid concerns. We don't have time to unpack all of them. I think the one thing I would say is that if you were giving any advice to the Prime Minister of Tuvalu, would it be to find a venue to try to figure out how to take a case sooner rather than later? I suppose, is there an argument that says that surely if more jurisdictions follow Vermont's lead around the world, framing legislation that just cuts through, accelerates a lot of this process, that the chances of getting some kind of a global bargain of indemnity coupled with the kind of payments, etc., that I suppose is what the idea of the adaptation funding that the global north is supposed to be paying as part of the COP process, but is failing to. But if it's directly levied on companies, if somehow there was some kind of grand bargain, surely the pressure for that would only come from the possibility of successful, both laws and litigation. Or as a layperson, am I just wrong?
No, I think you're absolutely right that it is the litigation that is currently creating the pressure, the idea that the companies are going to have to pay, or they may have to pay. What I would do if I was advising the government, a government like Tuvalu or any other small island state, though, is rather than saying, get involved in the litigation now, which is costly, timely, uncertain, I would say, try and use this to leverage the discussions around loss and damage and around who pays and how that should be done, and try and use this to argue for a solution like a global tax or getting companies to pay into a global fund or something of that nature, because I think that is ultimately a fairer and a better outcome. Now, I don't know how successful that would be, and it's not an either or thing, right? Tuvalu can think about how do its citizens start bringing cases, how do they support that, how do they bring their own cases, but I do think that what we need at this juncture is more integration between the discussions that are happening over here in the litigation space and now with these state-by-state pieces of legislation and the discussions that are happening in the global negotiating space.
Okay. Well, I suppose we'll wait and see on that one. And then two quick questions before we let you go. I know you have another thing coming up very soon. One is we had Loes van Dijk on the show not so long ago and discussing the Urgenda ruling came up, and in the context of a conversation about the kind of rise of let's say climate skeptic parties in Europe and potentially in the United States as a result of electoral outcomes. And she said something that really struck me with it, which was the Urgenda case gave her some comfort that the rule of law would allow for that precedent to stand and would make it very difficult for a populist government. And of course, as we're sitting here, the French are about to go for their second round of voting, which could result in a very climate skeptical majority in the French parliament. We might have an outlier outcome here in the UK, but certainly other elections we're looking around the world. It seems like climate ambition anyway, seems like it's on the political side, not going to be front burner for the foreseeable. So therefore, I suppose I got comfort. Maybe it's just a little bit of wish casting on my part, but I felt like, oh, that's such a good piece of good news. So you're not as scared about Geert Wilders trashing environment, climate legislation because you have this Urgenda ruling. Is she right?
I think the answer is, unfortunately, and it depends, right? Ultimately, whether or not governments are going to respond to the judgments that are issued against them depends on the level of respect that they have for the rule of law. And that's a political question. So in some cases where you have right-wing populist governments being elected, but they do demonstrate respect for the rule of law, they're willing to work within the system, then yes, I think she's right. These judgments are potentially very, very powerful. In cases where we have politicians who are willing to push the boundaries and go beyond that, I'm not sure how much protection these kinds of judgments are really going to give us. So I think it depends on the different countries. I mean, one thing I think is interesting is we saw earlier this year this important judgment in the case of Klima Signorin and Switzerland. So this is the Swiss ladies who've sued the Swiss government for years. They've been bringing this case for years, and they finally got to the European Court of Human Rights in Strasbourg. And the Strasbourg court has said they were right, and the Swiss government isn't doing enough to protect them from climate change. And the Swiss government needs to introduce a more stringent regulatory framework, right? What we've seen since then is the Swiss parliament, the lower house of the Swiss parliament, passing a resolution saying we're not going to comply with this judgment. Now, there's a different dimension to that. This wasn't a Swiss court that said it, right? This was the European Court of Human Rights in Strasbourg. And we know historically that their judgments have quite a low implementation rate. Or perhaps more accurately, that many of their judgments haven't been implemented. I would say that rather than low implementation rate. But still, I think that shows that there's more at stake here than just the court says something and governments immediately act, right? There's a series of intervening steps that all involve politics.
Right. And I think, as I understand it, that there was a non-binding resolution that the upper house passed and then the lower house followed. So, but again, it's sort of like a two fingers up to the ECHR, but also doesn't really have any particular force so much as just a protest vote saying, we don't like this, but the government's still stuck in a bind about whether or not to formally just tell the ECHR that we're going to ignore the ruling or not. So I guess wait and see. And finally, before we let you go, because I know you were really up against time and I'm very happy and generous, thankful you could join us. In terms of things that you're looking for, I mean, I suppose everyone looks at, or many people look at the litigation and process against big tobacco in the 90s, and they draw these parallels, with, the fossil fuel industry. Is there, and everyone looked at those cases, and if they've seen The Insider with Russell Crowe, or they're like, well, this romantic version of events that happened with that there was one moment where everything changed. There was a tipping point where there was a before and after. It was no longer possible to argue that tobacco, smoking did not cause these ill health effects. And there was a moment before that where the tobacco companies could argue that that's nonsense, and there was a moment after that, which did change a lot. They haven't gone away. They're doing other things, but it did change quite a lot. And so is there a moment that you can imagine, whether in the tort realm, whether in the human rights realm, whether in some of these other cases, where there's some seminal case that winds up breaking through the public consciousness and says, like, actually, this broke the back of the resistance of this industry?
I think the story will be more complicated. I mean, as you've already pointed out, the tobacco industry story is more complicated than just, someday they accepted that their products were harmful and they went away and they stopped selling tobacco. We just know that's not true, right? I think we could see some really interesting progress in both the polluter pays cases. So we could see a judgment against RWE in the case brought by Peruvian Saul Luciana Leluya, which could be a bit of an aha moment, because we'll actually have a court saying, yeah, the attribution science is valid. And I think that will change the way a lot of people are thinking. We could also see cases like the Milieu Défoncé and Shell case surviving on appeal. And we could see more courts issuing orders that say, what we need you to do is actually start reducing your emissions more rapidly, and we're ordering you not to invest in new oil and gas projects. And I think those could also have quite significant ramifications in public consciousness. They make a lot of sense, right? Like, if you are responsible for the problem, you need to stop causing the problem as quickly as possible. So I do think we could be moving towards that. But I think because of the way in which fossil fuels underpin so many other economic activities in a way that tobacco simply didn't, it will be more complex than what happened in the case of tobacco.
Right. Well, I have to leave there. Kate Hyam, Policy Fellow at the Grantham Institute. Thank you so much for coming on the program. Of course, we'll put everything in the show notes, and we hope we get you back soon.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been a pleasure.
One of the reasons I'm so glad I've gotten to know Dr. Tadzio Müller, the German, gay, anti-globalization, anti-capitalist, protest veteran, and climate activist, with whom on paper I should have, well, not a lot in common, is that I think we connected over a common experience, which is confronting a quite terrifying and sometimes shameful reality about where the climate is headed. Verdrängung, displacement, repression, is what he refers to as the psychological phenomenon. And while I think people I grew up with would be even more shocked than I would be, or certainly he would be, at being accused of being a Freudo-Marxist, I feel like it's one of those ideas that once you get it, you start seeing it in lots of places. As Orwell put it, to see what is in front of one's nose needs a constant struggle, which sounds easy enough. But when you combine Orwell's pithy line with the concept of Verdrängung, it's easier to understand why seeing things as they are could really be a constant struggle. Tomorrow night could wind up being an important moment in history, maybe a bookend to that night in 2016 where we watched Brexit votes seal the new course for the UK. Or it could just be an outlier. As we scramble to see in France the cobbling together 300 constituency-level deals to try and freeze out Jean-Marie Le Pen's Rassemblement National from gaining an overall majority in their parliament, which might have consequences for just about everything in Europe, but not least for the climate policy certainty that's enabled continued growth and investment in climate tech. We have to look at the US, where I was born but left 25 years ago because, let's just say, I couldn't rule out what we're seeing now and wanted to get clear of the blast radius. We see Joe Biden, one of the most consequential figures in climate policy, at least in the West, potentially felled by age and infirmity, putting on display 330 million people to see in an unforgiving CNN studio in the lighting of an unforgiving, potentially felled by age and infirmity, having put it on display, potentially felled by age and infirmity, having put those on display for 330 million people in the unforgiving lighting of a CNN studio. Between that and a U.S. Supreme Court that, while we were distracted by the debate, endorsed a Brexit-era Michael Gove line, and that we've had enough of experts, substantially preventing experts and agencies from actually being able to set policy on things like emissions, the U.S. has entered a period of political crisis unlike anything in my lifetime. And I've seen a few. And in today's Financial Times, columnist Martin Wolf came to a rather startling conclusion, given it's the Financial Times, one of the Bibles of capitalism. The market will not be able to force the changes necessary to avoid the worst climate outcomes. Just in a moment, when a political system looks less and less likely to be able to do something about it. Just at the moment we find out that June was the hottest month on record, 0.14 degrees hotter than last June and 0.4 degrees hotter than the previous El Nino event. And at that moment, leaving open the possibility of a second term for Donald Trump, who promises to end offshore wind on day one in the U.S. of a second presidency, and that's literally the most sane thing his team promises to inflict. Climate scientist Michael E. Mann, normally very measured in his language these days, put it in an interview last week. To him, Trump 2.0. To him, a Trump 2.0 means literally, quote, game over, unquote, for climate action worldwide. So I was happy to read James Murray, Business Green, writing to basically endorse at least the prospect held out by Ed Miliband's language around returning the UK to climate leadership and much besides. We'll be here at least for the 2 hours tomorrow, and maybe later, depending, between 9 and 11 p.m. Right in the middle of that, the exit polls will drop. We hope you register to join us, where thankfully people funnier than me, like Dr. Matt Winning, will use his alchemy to turn those base anxieties into comedy gold, and whatever else happens, it'll be a fun night, so tune in. History may be one damn thing after another, but sometimes it comes with fizzy wine, so there's that. See you tomorrow.
If you enjoyed this conversation, please share it and leave us a rating and review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. It helps others find the show. For an ad-free experience, consider becoming a paid subscriber at wickedproblems.earth. You'll get our newsletter, show notes, and exclusive content. Wicked Problems explores the intersection of people, politics, technology, and capital, and whether it creates a future you'd want to live in. Wicked Problems is written and edited by Richard Delavan, with production assistance from me, Theodore Delavan. Special thanks to Sun Charmer for our phenomenal theme music. Thanks for listening.